The author's preface and introduction to Nature and Grace by Matthias Joseph Scheeben. The scope and plan of this work are apparent from the table of contents and the introduction. In the brevity required of a preface, I can hardly hope to arouse the reader's interest in the subject. The title indicates simply that a systematic scientific treatment of nature and grace is envisaged. The exposition will be as profound and comprehensive as I can make it. Nature and grace must furnish the basis for a reasonable chart of life and growth. My cherished aim is to bring out the supernatural character of the Christian economy of salvation in its full sublimity, beauty, and riches. The main task of our time, it seems to me, consists in propounding and emphasizing the supernatural quality of Christianity for the benefit of both science and life. Theoretical as well as practical naturalism and rationalism, which seek to throttle and destroy all that is specifically Christian, must be resolutely and energetically repudiated. The concept of man's nature influences the whole area of philosophy. Similarly, the concept of man's place in Christianity is supremely important for its entire system of mysteries. If these mysteries lie beyond the reach of nature and reason, man can gain no part in them through the sole resources of his nature. He must receive a sort of new nature and must be raised by it to a higher sphere. When that is done, he can take on new mysterious relations with supernatural things and enter into a new, higher life. Grace imparts to man this higher state and this higher life. It invests nature with a kind of second, nobler nature, which we may fittingly call supernature, and so lays the foundation of an essentially superior order of things for man that differs from the natural order in every respect. We have undertaken in this work the task of bringing out the difference, opposition, and union of these two orders of things that mean so much to man. One of them has nature, the other has grace or supernature as its basis and center. The application of this doctrine to the clarification and mutual interconnection of all the mysteries of faith and Christian life can be only suggested here. A fuller treatment must await the future. But even the points that are developed in this book will be enough to show the incalculable value these mysteries have for our practical as well as our speculative life. In consulting source materials, I have made ample use of the teaching on grace so dear to the Greek fathers. Usually in the question occupying us, the doctrine developed by the Latin fathers against the Pelagians is almost the only one employed. St. Augustine tends to be regarded exclusively as the doctor of grace. He richly deserves the title, yet we must not forget that the standpoint he took was dictated by circumstances. In his controversies with the Pelagians, he did not and could not envisage grace as distinct from pure nature. He had to set grace against that Pelagian distortion of nature, that idol of the absolutely independent free will, which was haughtily indifferent to good. The Greek fathers, on the contrary, considered grace in its supernatural and divine excellence as a perfection that surpassed even what was true in the created world of nature. They saw grace in its relations with the mysteries of the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Eucharist. Against rationalistic Nestorianism, they pointed out that grace, like the Incarnation, has a supernatural, mysterious connection with the Godhead. Against the Manichaeans, Gnostics, and Eutychians, they brought to light the difference and opposition between nature and grace. They insisted that grace does not merge with nature and that it even possesses a certain autonomy. With remarkable penetration and incisiveness, these fathers, notably Cyril of Alexandria, triumphantly combated the naturalist and rationalist tendency that marked Nestorius and that had earlier appeared among the Arians. They remain the best allies in our conflict with modern rationalism, yet they have been studied least of all. Among outstanding theologians who have treated the subject, St. Thomas merits chief mention. Indeed, he drew up the plan and established the principles we follow. After him come the classic work of Dominic Soto, De Natura et Gratia, composed at the time of the Council of Trent, the monumental work of Francis Suarez, De Gratia, in 12 books, and Isaac Habert, Theologia Graecorum Patrum de Gratia. The Jesuit John Martinez de Ripalda has dealt expressly and copiously with our subject in his great work, De Ente Supernaturali. The present treatise takes a form that is speculative in development. I hoped that this procedure would be the easiest way toward the acquisition of clear concepts. But the whole edifice rests squarely on theological foundations, the Scriptures, the Fathers, and the teaching of the Church. Nothing has been fabricated out of thin air. The certitude of the assertions depends solely on the arguments adduced in their favour. Of set purpose, no attempt has been made to fix the theological qualifications of the opinions, although in itself this is an important item. The author did not trust himself to propose such censures, as he is too keenly aware of the incompetence of his judgment. He hopes rather that his views, proposed in the form of a simple investigation, may for that reason be more fairly examined and criticized. Some of the ideas will strike many readers as being novel and unknown, but they are not innovations. They are the teachings which make up the oldest and most venerable fund of doctrine about the mysteries of Christianity to be found among the Holy Fathers. The true mind of these ancient fathers and of the great scholastics has eluded the new spirit of our century. In any case, the author has the intention of teaching not what he has learned by his own efforts, but what he has received from illustrious men in the Church. He perceives only too clearly how unequal his poor powers are to the task of satisfactorily carrying out the enterprise he set himself. Nevertheless, he has dared to undertake it with the purpose of focusing the attention of scholars on these points, that others who are abler with the pen may write about them more worthily. He may often have strayed from this difficult path. If so, it is incumbent on experts to pass pertinent judgment, on the author to acknowledge his mistake, and on you, dear reader, to forgive the error. And if you are willing to add to your forgiveness the friendly service of pointing out such errors, you will find him more anxious to learn than eager to speak. Here I should like to bring these preliminary remarks to a close. However, there is one item about which I believe I ought to come to an agreement with my readers from the outset. Throughout this work, I have ventured to use the word supernature to stand for grace in the proper sense, the grace of divine sonship by which we share in the divine nature. I employ the word to stress the distinction between grace and nature. The sequel will make its meaning clear and will justify it. I beg the gracious reader to bear with me patiently when I come to explain the term, for in a certain respect, especially in the application I make of it, it may appear to be novel and for that reason may alienate some minds. As has been indicated above, grace is here considered as the foundation of a truly higher, supernatural order of life, in contrast to the natural order. If the exposition is to be successful, we must be able to designate this property of grace clearly and distinctly with a technical term that is short and precise. The word grace can be drawn down to the level of nature and natural things, and in point of fact is frequently misunderstood. It covers God's unmerited love of us, all the effects of that love, including the natural ones, and any state in man that is pleasing to God, even on the plane of simple morality. It can also refer to anything that is supernatural, such as God's supernatural love of us and all its consequences. We could, of course, be content with expressions canonized by sacred scripture and ecclesiastical usage like sanctifying grace, grace of divine sonship, and participation in the divine nature. These expressions are free enough from ambiguity, but they are not sufficiently sharp and concise to serve as technical terms for our purpose. A good term must bring out what the Apostle designated by new creature and the Fathers by new nature, divine race, and the like. In a number of modern languages, we are fortunate enough to have not only the adjective supernatural as opposed to natural, but also the substantive supernature as opposed to nature, although this term has gained currency only in recent times. It has all the advantages we could wish. The course of our exposition must show whether the extensive employment of the word is really as useful or even necessary as it seemed to be to the author. At first sight, the term supernature may appear hard to understand, and even to open the door to gross misunderstandings. Our conviction is that it is hard to understand only for those who have no clear idea of a supernatural order of life among men, and that it will subsequently be clarified and vindicated by its evident utility and basic intelligibility. As for the other objection, there is no word that is not open to misunderstanding. Indeed, the relative vagueness of the other expressions that are usually employed in this connection subjects them to outrageous misinterpretation. Supernature can refer to the higher nature of another being that stands above a lower nature, and can therefore designate the highest nature of all, the divine nature. For that very reason, supernature, when found within the domain of nature, is the lower human nature's participation in the perfection proper to the supreme divine nature. This work is commended to the fair judgment of the reader and to the blessing of God, to whose greater glory in the mysteries of his grace it is dedicated. A friendly reception will hearten the author to undertake further investigations. starting from the points that have been established, to shed clear light on the meaning and interconnection of the other mysteries of Christianity, and thus to contribute his mite toward the promotion of genuine Christian learning and Christian life. The introduction. The vast seething commotion among religious questions of the present age, which is still vacillating between two extremes, is but the continuation of a conflict that has grievously occupied and shaken the Church during these latter centuries. This is a situation that unfortunately has received too little attention. The battle that has been fought on the ethical field for several centuries has in recent times spilled over into the intellectual sphere. On the ethical terrain, two hostile views were locked in struggle, with the Catholic teaching holding the centre. One view was that man's nature carried within itself at least the seed of all good which it could ever reach, including the Christian good. No more than some favourable influence from outside was needed to develop that seed to full maturity. This was the Pelagian and later the Socinian view, but its characteristic features took final shape in semi-Pelagianism, in which, tragically, many theologians of the modern era have seen their own minds reflected. Opposed to this view was another, which maintained that man's nature, as disfigured by original sin, is utterly incapable of any true good or noble morality. It does not even contain a good seed, which would at least enable it to begin to produce, if not completely to develop, good fruit. This was the Lutheran and Jansenist view. The Church had waged war against the first view 1,000 years earlier in the person of one of its greatest champions, St. Augustine. A brilliant victory had been won, and within the space of a few years the haughty error was suppressed. Yet the heresy had sprung up again and found room enough to run through all the phases of uninterrupted growth, from rank profusion to specialized culture. Stage by stage, with greater care and foresight, the Church had to renew the battle against it. The true malignancy of the canker was perceived more and more clearly. At length the error was plucked out by the roots. The teaching of Augustine, as set forth in his last books, prevailed and was raised to the level of dogma. According to this teaching, by original sin, man lost all capacity and power for the good to which he had been destined by his Creator and for which he had originally been equipped. He did not even retain the seed which, under the action of outside influences, could develop and thus realize its inherent potentialities. But this very teaching of the Church and its whole substructure as supplied by St. Augustine were exploited to the advantage of the other error. The Church had established the doctrine that the true life of the soul had not only been obstructed by original sin, but had been completely eradicated down to the last root, and that consequently the soul had lost all its power and tendency to reach its original destiny. The heretics drew the false conclusion that the soul had forfeited all higher life, all power for all true morality and religion, as well as a capacity for any good. It had become evil and corrupt either in its substance, Luther, or in its faculties, Baius, or in its inclinations, Jansenius. As this error gradually evolved and drew out its subtle inferences, it was painstakingly and decisively combated by the Church. From its high vantage point, ecclesiastical scholarship won the dogmatic battle even before it concluded its campaign against the first error. The victory was clinched by the thoroughgoing and detailed condemnation of the teaching of Baius. This proclamation clarified the entire issue with so clear and searching a light that it forestalled the refined subtleties which spun a web of captious sophisms around the condemned propositions as they were fabricated not only by the heretical Jansenists, but also, sad to record, by certain theologians in the Church. It further furnished a norm for judging all other theories spawned by the same basic error. This was made possible by the explanation that God could have created man with no other gifts than those he now receives at his birth. That even now man is a good work, produced by God, and enters the world with a capacity for good, having within himself the power to labour for its development. That he is still endowed with an inborn ability to perform morally good acts, and even possesses the faculty of eliciting the highest of all acts in the sphere of ethics, love of God as the author of nature. Where is the signpost pointing out the road which the Church has trod between two such apparently contradictory teachings, one of which must seemingly be accepted as true if the other is rejected as false? Where is the lofty vantage ground which the Church has occupied to engage them both in simultaneous battle? It was radically the same in both conflicts, that against the Pelagians and that against the Bionists and Jansenists. But against the former, the position was inadequately and materially conceived, whereas against the latter, it was adequately and formally conceived. It was the viewpoint of the original supernatural destiny for which man was to labour, and according to which the goodness of his actions had to be judged. From this standpoint, the Church taught, especially through St. Augustine's writings against the Pelagians, that fallen nature had completely lost the ability, supernaturally communicated to it in the beginning, to reach that destiny which the first man could have attained with the aid of the endowment originally given to him by God, and which has again been opened to fallen man by grace. Left to itself, however, the soul was dead to that destiny. At this stage, man's supernatural destiny was still regarded materially rather than formally. That is, it was thought of as a destiny which is supernatural, but the full extent to which it is supernatural was not always realized. The point at issue was not to show what nature can do, but only to prove that the perfection which the Pelagians ascribed to nature, ability to work for such a destiny, is beyond the competency of nature. But this very fact that our supernatural destiny was not considered in its formal aspect lent to the opposite error a spurious importance when the Church later came to grips with the problem. Thereupon the Church took pains to bring out the true supernatural character of our destiny. It explained that man, in consequence of original sin, lost only his ability to work for his supernatural destiny, but another sphere of activity was still possible, the natural sphere. Ability and power to act in this domain, though somewhat curtailed, still remained in the seed of nature. This distinction between a natural and a supernatural sphere of activity, between a natural and a supernatural ethical order, as also between a twofold capacity and equipment in man, a distinction that appears most striking in the state of elevated man in paradise and of fallen man, is the two-edged sword the Church took up when it sallied forth to join battle with both errors. It not only cut them down, but thoroughly hacked them out by their roots. Although the Church was not forced to an explicit formulation of this distinction until the second error confronted it, we must acknowledge that the first error could have been eradicated more easily and decisively if the distinction had received prominence at the time. For to some extent at least, one of the main difficulties facing the semi-Pelagians in the supposition of fallen man's absolute inability to work for his real end was the fear of falling into Manichaeism, the Lutheranism of ancient times. This fear could not be completely eliminated unless the assurance was forthcoming that man was able to work in another field of activity that still remained open to him. As in the case of many other dogmas, the distinction between the two ethical orders incontestably owes its sharper conception and formulation to a polemic against opposing heresies. The doctrine of two different orders of spiritual man's destiny and activity was the secure, but also the necessary standpoint from which the Church and its teachers launched their attack against Luther, Baius, and Jansenius. But the enemies, especially the Jansenists, had perceived the importance of this position just as the Church itself had, and therefore turned all their artillery and picked columns against it. And we must admit that they conducted the campaign with fanatic energy and marvellous ingenuity. They fought it out on poorly mapped terrain that had not been thoroughly explored by the Latin Fathers, and knew how to find and utilize its difficulties to their own advantage. In spite of their assaults, Catholic theology held its ground. It was aware of the ascendancy of its position and strained every nerve to beat back the charges of the enemy, as well as to protect and fortify its lines against future attacks. The enemy disguised himself and changed uniforms 1,000 times in an effort to gain the upper hand by deception and treachery. And all the while certain theologians, who had been led astray by the morbid spirit of the age, or refused to attune their minds to ecclesiastical teaching, sought to introduce a subtle and specious form of the error into the Church. But the right cause triumphed, and at length received renewed confirmation from the bull Auctorem Fidei of Pius VI. Theology had won this position as the climax of a grievous struggle that had lasted for 300 years, and with it as a base solved the great ethical questions which agitated minds in those days. Why should we not make it our own to solve the vexing intellectual and ontological problems of the present century? From the time when these problems first began to interest me, and I as yet had no confidence that I could see more deeply into them, the realization was forced on me that, in spite of the generous efforts which had been expended on our stormy German soil by men of true talent and serious purpose, that hard-won achievement of past centuries had attracted scarcely any notice and had influenced thinking even less. Even if this solution did not have all the importance that, as I hope to show in this work, really belongs to it, at least it merited earnest consideration. Everything else, whatever its source or nature may be, is hailed as an experiment leading toward progress, and scholars use it and believe they must draw it into their own orbit. This is the reason why questions bearing on religious knowledge, on faith and understanding, on reason and revelation, and hence on the mysteries themselves, particularly the chief mysteries such as the Divine Trinity, the nature and effects of original sin, the necessity of the Incarnation, and the meaning of the sacraments, have in many cases not met with the satisfactory solution and clarification that had been expected. Investigators did not go back to the basic truth of two different spheres and orders of knowledge and being. They neglected to build on the glorious foundations laid by our forefathers, or to stand on their shoulders. Many disdained to carry farther the project inaugurated by others, although that attitude has been given up by now, and wished to strike out a new line of their own. And in more recent times, unfortunately, in spite of the most sincere intentions, unremitting labour, and praiseworthy acumen, many did not feel confident that they could rediscover the solid terrain from which the tempests of the century had dislodged them. The inevitable result of all this was that, down to our own time, an enervating indecision ruled in this domain, and thinkers could not find the safe middle ground between two extremes that were no less antagonistic than Jansenism and Pelagianism were in the field of ethics. On the one side, the fact is indisputable that nature lost not only a part, but all of its power to reach the truth in which it originally lived and ought ever after to have lived. To regain possession of this truth, it unconditionally needed a foundation that could not be laid again except by Christ, and could not be made over to us except by external and internal revelation. On the other side, the Church has repeatedly rejected the teaching that robs fallen man of all capacity for knowledge and blinds it to all noble and religious truth. As though outside and alongside the truth offered to us by Christ, it did not have its own proper sphere of knowledge about divine and spiritual things. Here again the Church proposes two doctrines that seem to contradict each other, yet both have been simultaneously upheld by the Church. Even if we had no definitive evidence about the mind of the Church, this fact alone would impose the conclusion that the Church recognizes, in the intellectual as well as the moral domain, two radically different and opposite orders of spiritual activity that have nothing in common. For the higher order can be completely abolished without the lower order being affected except by the loss of the advantage coming to it from its connection with the higher order. As long as we do not accept the doctrine of two provinces and orders of knowledge, or regard the higher merely as a more perfect evolution of the lower without a new foundation of its own, or look on the foundation of the order that is left as a simple expedient for promoting the naturally restricted development of that order. In general, as long as we recognize only one basic order of knowledge and yet desire to remain faithful to the positive teachings of the Church, we shall not be able to reconcile those teachings, but must fall into one or the other of the extreme errors condemned by ecclesiastical authority, depending on which one we retain. One alternative is to hold that nature still possesses an active power of knowledge extending to its own sphere, and that grace and revelation are no more than aids favourable to the development of natural powers within their own domain. All known truths will be drawn into the realm of nature, which can employ its own resources to grasp them, and can find within its own circle concepts or ideas corresponding to them. Revelation can be necessary only to develop reason more surely, easily and quickly, and can at most furnish a few positive data about some of God's special designs for the human race. But its object cannot belong to a higher sphere, and its object is not enveloped in any obscurity other than that which in general shrouds the deeper essence of familiar things from our minds. The upshot of all this is our modern rationalizing tendency in theology, which seeks to draw all revealed truths down to the level of reason, to demonstrate them with rational principles, and to squeeze them into the mold of pre-existing concepts. This tendency is, in the intellectual domain, more or less what Pelagianism is in the field of ethics. The Church has repeatedly spoken out its mind against it, in a way to leave no room for doubt. But if, in the same hypothesis of a single order of truth and knowledge, we turn to the other fundamental position maintained by the Church, that nature lacks the inherent power of rising to the exalted region of those truths which invest the Christian religion with its characteristic features, we inevitably come to the diametrically opposed view that nature, unsupported by divine helps from within and without, is incapable of knowing the slightest religious truth, and that reason, in Luther's phrase, is nothing but futile darkness. We favour that position which believes that it opposes rationalism as its contradiction, though not as its contrary, and claims to hold the only key for entirely escaping that error. This attitude was unable to win much headway among German philosophers, but met with a friendly reception in neighbouring countries that were more exposed to Jansenist influences. This last extreme could indeed be called in as an ally for undermining rationalism, but even more easily could rationalism unhinge traditionalism and other systems that disparage natural reason, whatever their names may be. Pitch nature out, but it will always come back. We cannot gainsay nature. The will can, within limits, take evil to itself as a second nature, but reason cannot. That is why the thinking mind repels traditionalism, whereas it may yield to the seductions of rationalism. However, as long as the two above-mentioned teachings of the Church stand together, neither of the two errors can dislodge the other, since both come to a halt at the same spot. The seeming opposition between the two teachings of the Church remains until we discern that third point of view, which enables us to bring them both into harmony, and so to topple over the foundation of the two corresponding errors. We have to show that there is one order of truths, whose light has set for us, and another whose light still shines for us. Thus it becomes clear why I said in the beginning that to settle our intellectual crisis we must go back to the achievement of past centuries, and in the spirit of the Church distinguish between two orders of knowledge and truth, as well as between two kinds of ethically good actions in man. But for an adequate understanding of the two orders in the ethical and intellectual spheres, we must penetrate to a deeper level in which both are united on a common basis. From that point we shall be able to survey the entire field of the forces locked in struggle, and at the same time acquire a new, more profound insight into the object and sources of our religious knowledge and love, particularly of that knowledge and love which I have designated as the higher, and which have the so-called mysteries of faith for their object and principle. The powers of knowledge and love are rooted together in the substance and nature of the soul, for nature is the common source of all the powers in a being. The more perfect the nature, the more perfect its powers. Therefore, the perfection and extent of knowledge and love are proportionate to the degree of perfection in the soul and its powers of comprehension, through which it can enter into a more or less intimate union with outside beings, to receive them into itself by knowledge and to embrace them with love. Accordingly, the perfection and extent of our knowledge and love of God depend on the relation of our nature with Him. And if we wish to rise to a particularly perfect knowledge and love of God that is specifically distinct from that which we possess through our essential relation to Him as creatures to Creator, we must receive a certain kind of second nature from God. I repeat, we must receive a sort of new nature, not by the addition of a new substance or by the implanting of radically new faculties in the soul, but by a transfiguration and elevation of our whole nature with all its faculties to a higher sphere. We must be spiritually born of God and clothed with the garments of His children. Then we shall no longer stand afar off like servants, but will be welcomed like children to His fatherly presence, and will be admitted to those secrets of His majesty and love which, while we were still remote from Him, were closed and foreign to us. In other words, to gain a thorough, solid grasp of the distinction between the two orders of knowledge and morality, we must trace them back to their common foundation, a double ontological order. This is the source and norm of our knowledge and love in their subjective and objective, their formal and material aspects. Subjectively and formally, knowledge and love proceed from the power a being possesses, conformably with the excellence and fullness of his nature. Objectively and materially, the realm of things and relations which constitute the object of intellectual and ethical activity accords with the perfection and nature of the acting subject, since his activity does not extend beyond limits with which he has some contact in his concrete existence. Since we are now speaking of religious knowledge and love, and therefore mainly of knowledge and love of God, and of all other things so far as they are referred to Him, the twofold order must be based on a double ontological order of man with regard to God. This means that man enters into a twofold relationship with God through a twofold nature he receives from Him. In the first place, man receives human nature from God along with his existence, and thereby enters into relationship with Him as the creator of this nature. But human nature, as spiritual, necessarily includes a definite power and tendency towards knowledge and love, and is their source. The measure of this knowledge and love is nature itself, for nature itself is their proximate object, and beyond that God is their object, so far as he stands in relationship with nature. However, as we shall see, man receives from God not only a nature proportionate to his proper mode of being, but a higher nature, which is accidental, not substantial, whereby he is refashioned on the model of the higher divine nature. This sort of second nature, which is superior to his own proper nature, we shall later call it supernature, first causes in man the dawning of a new light that makes him capable of a higher knowledge and love. It further places him in a new, special relationship with God, who now draws near to man in his own essence, and not only as creator of a nature foreign to him. Thereupon, conformably with his higher power of knowledge and love, man is admitted into a higher world of objects in which he can move about. Thus the question why and how there are two orders of knowledge and love with reference to God is clearly settled by answering that two different orders of being are established in the relationship of the rational creature with God. Christianity claims this higher order of being, knowledge and love, or in other words, this superior ontological, logical and ethical order exclusively as its own. Consequently, the exposition of the distinction between the two orders, natural and supernatural, gets its greatest and deepest meaning from the conception of Christianity itself. Christianity cannot be comprehended in its due nobility and its true inner quality unless its real specific difference from all that is merely natural and rational, that is, from all that lies in the realm of nature and of reason, is clearly perceived. Christianity presents itself in its perfection as something that is absolutely supernatural and mysterious. And it is supernatural as an institution because it has as its end something that is absolutely supernatural and mysterious. This supernatural character and mysterious depth of Christian finality, and hence the necessity of its supernatural constitution, particularly its function as intermediary with regard to God, revelation and grace, rightly form the object of the chief and vital question dividing the Church from rationalists and indifferentists. This question has deservedly occupied our theologians and apologists, especially in our day. But the crisis has not yet been completely settled, and it will not be settled until this supernatural order is frankly, adequately, and radically distinguished from the natural order. The standpoint that has been given must serve as a basis for a definition of the supernatural and the mysterious in general, and in particular. And the definition must be such that its very simplicity and aptness commend it, even if there were no urgent need of it. As regards Christian ontology, the previously mentioned elevation of human nature, exaltatio humanae naturae in consortium divinae naturae, that is, the higher mode of existence which is not essentially required by human nature, is supernatural. Further, the resulting activities and relations, especially those referring to God, are supernatural. From our point of view, we can say that God's existence is supernatural when it enters into a relationship not merely with our inborn nature, but with our elevated nature. We can also designate as supernatural those works and institutions of God which contribute directly to the establishment of man's supernatural union with God. With regard to Christian epistemology, the same order is mysterious, that is, it is hidden from natural reason which, by itself and its natural resources, cannot know such an order. It lies above the reach of reason, for it surpasses reason as much as it surpasses nature. Reason is not only unable to comprehend the supernatural perfectly, but can at best find among its concepts very deficient analogues for the realities of the supernatural order. Finally, Christian ethics owes its special superhuman holiness to the fact that it measures up to the supernatural and mysterious relationships which rest on the elevation of human nature brought about by its participation in the divine nature, and therefore can be known only by faith, not by reason, the instrument of nature. Since all that is specifically Christian is identical with what is supernatural, mysterious, and holy in Christianity, we can use this general norm to discern which truths are genuinely characteristic of Christianity. Such are all truths that refer to man's supernatural union with God, or that come to light in this union. This procedure will bring out the full characteristic excellence of Christianity. I shall venture even farther and say this is the only way we can grasp the inherent value, meaning, and interconnection of the truths of Christianity, and consequently organize a truly Christian body of knowledge. Whenever these truths are not assigned their own exclusive sphere and are intermingled with truths of the natural order, they are necessarily confused with the latter, and therefore not only lose their organic union with truths of their own kind, but suffer a dimming of their own light. And in fact, we know by experience that those theologians who do not base their theology on these definitions of the supernatural either fail to put together a sound, orderly system of Christian truths, or, if they make the attempt, inevitably disfigure the dogmas themselves. The foundation of the natural order of things is nature, and the domain of natural knowledge, including that of natural ethics, is fixed by nature. In a similar way, the foundation of the supernatural order of things, and hence of the supernatural sphere of knowledge and ethics, is the elevation of human nature to a participation in the divine nature. My intention is to bring out the supernatural character of Christianity in its true genius and in its influence on the whole range of its doctrines, as well as on the Christian life that stems from them. I shall begin by discussing as thoroughly and adequately as I can the two orders of life corresponding to the states of pure nature and of elevated nature in man. I shall particularly endeavour to exhibit and emphasize the true grounds on which each of the two orders is constructed, and the centre around which each revolves, that is, the ontological or metaphysical element of which I spoke above. In the natural order, this element is plain enough. No one has ever philosophized about the natural order of life in man without starting from, or at least reverting to, the nature of man on which it rests and to which it conforms. But in the supernatural order, this point is often neglected. No foundation analogous to nature is looked for, and that is the reason why a clear, sound idea of the supernatural order is so rarely achieved.